I loved the first 6 years of Heartbeat when I played the sergeant. And I loved the crew, and loved the cast, Nick Berry, Neve Cusack. And I thought the first 6 years were very special, very authentic, very much of the period. And it became a big, huge success.
Put lead in your pencil, this will, Ventris. Right, now the toast is, and I never thought these words would ever pass my lips, the toast is Claude Jeremiah Greengrass.
Claude Jeremiah Greengrass.
How would I introduce At Home with Derek Fowlds? Well, it's a very personal documentary that looks at the life and career of a very special man, very dear friend. The actor Derek Fowlds, known to many for Basil Brush, Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister, Heartbeat, but a man with a tremendous career that spanned many decades on stage, on film and on television. The documentary includes extensive interviews we recorded with Derek at his home in the West Country in a beautiful little village quite near Bath, joined by his dear friend Michael Sellers, who helped him write his autobiography, A Part Worth Playing, and Helen, his partner, makes a brief appearance towards the end as well. The documentary came about, I think, because we had recorded a great interview with Derek for our documentary on Peter Cushing. Now, Derek had worked with Peter back in, I think, 1966 on Frankenstein Created Woman for Hammer Films down at Bray Studios, and had incredibly fond memories of Peter. So we interviewed him for that documentary, and then he revealed this fantastic letter that he's got on the wall of his office, a fan letter from Peter, written in the 1980s, of Peter expressing his joy at watching Yes Minister. So it became very clear that Derek had a lot of memories, a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes and a lot of memorabilia and mementos that he'd built up over his long career. And we got to know Derek very well after making the Peter Cushing documentary, and I suggested to him, well, why don't we make a documentary about you, At Home with Derek Fowlds? And we would visit his home, we'd have a look around, we'd look at some of the wonderful knickknacks, memorabilia, posters, photographs of his wonderful career. And find out some of the stories, find out the background about what he'd been doing, how he got into acting, the career that he had, some of the very, very famous names he'd worked with over the years. And he was just such a tremendous fount of stories. When we recorded the interviews back in 2019, he was in his 80s. He was quite frail, but still full of energy and full of stories. And it was a huge shock when he sadly passed away in January earlier this year. And so this became, quite by chance, the last project that Derek had worked on, and we became very keen to make sure it was a fitting tribute for somebody who was not just a great actor, but a wonderful, wonderful person. We've spoken to a lot of people about Derek in recent months and over the last couple of years, in fact, and nobody had a bad word to say about Derek. He was loved by his friends, by his family and by those in the industry, which is quite a unique thing to say. He was so grounded, so down to earth, very little airs and graces about Derek. And when we got to his home, I remember on the day we were filming the first interview, he was just so welcoming. He made us feel at home. The hospitality he'd laid on with Helen as well was just astonishing. And it was a great, great set of days getting the material together for the documentary.
I was doing a play in Worthing, and the stage doorman said, "Derek?" "Yeah." "Dirk Bogard on the phone." I said, "What?" So I said, "Hello." He said, "It's Dirk." I said, he said, "What are you doing? Do you want to come to Florence for a holiday before you go to America?" I said, "What?" He said, "There's a scene I have to do in this film. You just lie by a swimming pool, and I burn your hand, and I take your, clothes tag, and that's all you have to do." I said, "Do I say anything?" He said, "No." He said, "You could do it." Oh, and if you ever see that film, it's never off. And people ring me up and say, "You didn't do much in that, did you?" And it was Dirk and Betty Box who took me out for a holiday. Yeah, I love Dirk.
What's the trouble, Comrade?
Well, you burned me, you fool.
I'm sorry, I must have burnt you with my cigarette.
I think it's an important document in its own right, because it really does get under the skin of a person and their life, their family, their friends and their career. And Derek at times got very emotional as he reminisced and reflected back on some of the events of his life. And some of them have been very traumatic and very tragic in many ways. A great affection for his mum too, who had encouraged him. Very pragmatic woman by all accounts. His father had died when he was much younger, and so he was brought up by his mother and his grandmother. And she was very supportive, but in a very practical, pragmatic way. If you can make this work, then you've got my support. Otherwise, you're going to have to carry on your career as an apprentice at the print works in Berkhamsted, where he's working at the time. So getting into RADA, getting into acting, was something that happened almost by chance. He'd been in school plays, and Enid, his English teacher at school, had been very encouraging and put him into a few productions. He'd joined the Amateur Dramatic Society at the Printers, where he was an apprentice in Berkhamsted. And then when he did his national service, he kind of got involved in productions there, and it's where he met Donald Douglas, a very good friend of his, the very famous actor now, Donald Douglas, who encouraged him to think about going to RADA. And as Derek says, well, RADA? I didn't know what RADA was. He thought it was something electrical. In fact, it was Donald who sent off for the audition paperwork for him on his behalf and encouraged him to go forward. And by chance, he got into RADA. And he comes up with some great stories about how he got there, but also some very moving stories of how his mother broke the news to him and who subsequently was in the back of the auditorium for that audition.
Ooh. She said, "You've won a scholarship and a grant, and you start on April the 2nd, 1958.
The thing I learned most, I think, about Derek doing the documentary was not just from the interviews, but from the background reading. I took the opportunity to read his autobiography, A Part Worth Playing, which is an astonishing read. And because it was kind of ghost-written to some extent with his novelist friend, Michael Sellers, it really was a genuine page-turner. It's a book that he'd written with Michael, and what Derek used to do was to record the anecdotes onto cassette, send the tapes to Michael, who would then type it up and turn it into prose. So when we got to do the documentary and record the interviews themselves, you were well armed with all the information you needed to have a great set of conversations with Derek. And some of the interviews then that we recorded as a result of that, I think became more relaxed, more open, more in-depth. And Derek really opened up and gave so much more information than I think if you'd just done a quick skim of the facts from press cuttings and gone in there with a kind of journalistic interview. What we got was something that was more in-depth and very personal. And that, I think, makes it very special. And it was a great experience just being with Derek as he recounted those stories, and at one point breaking down into tears too. But getting and learning most was the sheer breadth and depth of his career. Here's a guy who graduated from RADA in the late 1950s, who had a success in the West End. He'd been in, 16, 19 West End shows on Broadway. I think Chips with Everything he took to Broadway and was a huge success over there. And then got into television in the UK. He says, quite in a kind of comical kind of way, that people know him for Basil Brush, Heartbeat, Yes Minister. But actually he's done so much more. Being on stage with Alistair Sim, with Robert Morley, being on screen with the likes of Dirk Bogarde in Too Hot for June, and all sorts of things like that. There's real breadth and depth to his career. And that's, I think, the most important thing that I discovered about Derek was there's so much to discover about Derek.
I did enjoy working with Ivan Owen, who looked after Basil, and lovely George Martin, who wrote these scripts. And I thought, OK, I'll do a second series. And it was that series that kind of something extraordinary happened, that one day I was laughing with Basil and I looked at him and the buttons became eyes, and I put my arm around him and the fur became a tail, and I fell in love with Basil. He became my best mate.
In the last few years of his life, his health wasn't at its best, but there was a real energy, there was a glow in his eyes. They really lit up when he recounted the stories and also looked ahead to some of the things he wanted to do in the future. He tells a story in the documentary about how he'd gone back on stage the first time in 16 or 18 years with his friend Donald Douglas, of a kind of two-header, one-act play that was performed at a theatre in France. So there was great energy about what was to come. It wasn't just about looking back because he was at the end of his life or the end of his career. It was very much about, okay, now what's next? So there's that energy, the vibrancy within it. But you could tell that his health was a little bit rusty, but he was battling through and going with it. His memory was razor sharp. He could recall the incidents, the dates, the events, the people. He can probably even tell you the colour of the usherette's hair at the cinema where he went to see a particular film. His memory was that detailed and that sharp. And so it was a real shock, when in 2020, January, we discovered that he'd suddenly passed away. And, in many ways it wasn't surprising, but in some ways it was a complete shock and very, very saddening. We'd got to know Derek very well. He was a great friend. He's a lovely person, a wonderful personality, so down to earth, so engaging, no airs or graces, as I've said already. And so it was really, really upsetting, and we were very sad to see him go.
As an actor, you feel blessed. As a jobbing actor, I've been very lucky. We never give up. Just the phone stops ringing. Yeah.
Actors don't retire, do they?
They don't retire, no, they don't give up the business. The business sometimes gives you up, but not yet.
I think I remember Derek just laughing, sitting there on his sofa, his arms crossed, giggling and smiling and reminiscing and coming up with some real great anecdotes about his life and career. There was a cheeky, mischievous personality that sat there, and I will remember him for that, and I remember him for laughing during the interviews. I remember him for the great joy that he brought us during his body of work, his career, but also I remember him for his great friendship and for the laughter during the interviews and during the documentary. But I just remember him as being the wonderful Derek Fowlds.